Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a special rebroadcast of our third in the fall webinar series. Our special presentation today of Bench to Bedside, our webinar on the drug development and regulatory process from sort of the laboratory to your medicine cabinet. Today, we have a very special speaker, our new project manager for our research capacity buildings project. But I wanted to take a brief moment before I introduce her to give you a little bit of an idea about why we're doing this particular workshop today. This workshop was actually presented live over Zoom on November 29th, and it was simultaneously interpreted due to a bit of a technical difficulty on my part. Unfortunately, we missed recording the English version, so we're re-presenting it today without an audience so that we can make sure that this important information is available to everybody on our website. So for those that don't know me, I'm Jamie Myra. I'm the executive director here at PHA Canada. And I wanted to take a brief moment to introduce you to a new project that we've just launched called the Research Capacity Building Project. It's a project that Pat's going to be managing for the next year or two. And it basically has three main goals. And the first one is related to patient empowerment, to making sure that patients are driving the research agenda in Canada, that you as people living with PH are in leadership positions, helping to make decisions at every step of the research process. And we're going to learn about what those steps are today. The second objective is around improving coordination and collaboration among the PH researchers across the country, in particular through a new network that's being developed, a new clinical trials network that's being developed. And the third one is around increasing access to new forms of patient data and information. So we'll learn a little bit today about the importance of patient information. And so we're really looking to support the development of Canada's PH registry, see more PH patients participating in that, and see it collecting new forms of information as well, so that we have really good access to new sources of information about PH in Canada. So the timing of this workshop was really good. We knew that this project was launching. And so this was the reason why we decided to make this topic, which we've actually presented before in Connections magazine in the past, but make it the topic for today's educational webinar, so that we could use this opportunity to introduce you a little bit to these new priorities for PHA Canada and to our new project manager, Pat. So with that, I'll let Pat introduce herself a little bit and tell you more about today's session. Welcome, Pat.
Thanks, Jamie. My name's Pat Kelly, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, virtually. And my background is actually in advocacy, and in particular in cancer control advocacy, but I also have a background in immunology research, and that's how I started my career many years ago. But when I was diagnosed with cancer, I shared a lot of the same concerns that you have around the PH disease, which is, how do we prevent the disease? How do we improve treatment? How do we improve access to diagnosis and to specialists? So I share some of those concerns with you, and what I bring to the table, I think, is experience in this area and in working with a lot of people who are passionate about changing health policy and influencing the path of their own diagnosis and treatment, and improving things for people in the future. So that's the beginning of my role in this is to share with you what this path of bench to bedside actually looks like. And I thought we'd start today with just laying out what is it that we hope people take away from this webinar in particular, and the overall projects. And that is for today to understand how new treatments are tested for safety and effectiveness, how they become publicly funded or not, and to understand the important role that patients play in the development of new drugs, and of course in public funding for those. We're going to skip over in our recording today the pre and post test polls, because that's not something we're going to be able to deliver on. But I wanted to lay out for you here what the steps are, and in that process, from the very beginning of a big idea, from a researcher who may be working in a lab in Atlanta or Berlin or in South Africa. So what we know is we have a broad network of basic scientists who are working to bring new developments and new treatments for all kinds of diseases. But everything starts with that big idea and moves through the process then of the initial bench studies that are done on cells individually, and then clinical studies, which are done on individual populations of patients, usually larger and larger patient sizes over the clinical trial period for longer periods of time. And then that information is reviewed by government agencies. Here in Canada, it's Health Canada. Internationally, it would be other government agencies. And then once Health Canada approves the evidence and says, yes, we support this, this is safe and effective, then it has to go through processes to eventually become included in provincial and federal drug benefit payment programs. And that's the process. All of those processes are complex, and we want to walk you through what they mean here in Canada and how they work here. So the first step is the research bench. And that's where we say the sky's the limit. So whatever that big idea is, it has to start at the drawing board. And if that treatment is then identified to be, or the initial, it might not even be a treatment, it might just be, again, just the concept. And the scientist has to take a few of those initial steps in the lab before things can be tested on people. And those testing starts with on cells, on individual cells, or on tissue samples, and in humane animal studies. We're fortunate today to hear from one of our scholarship recipients. And
hello everyone, I'm Grobbs, a PhD student in pulmonary hypertension research group in Quebec. It's a great pleasure to be with you today for this webinar and sharing our work here in the laboratory in this short video. My field of interest was vascular remodeling when I have met parents of children with PH. So that's why I decided to be part of this big challenge of helping people with pulmonary hypertension disease. So here in the laboratory, the first part is to identify, for example, a protein who is overexpressed or overactivated in cells of PH patient compared to control patient. For that, we can use computer analysis, or we can also check on a literature in cancer, because PH cells and cancer cells are sharing a lot of similarities, like hyperproliferation and resistance of death. Then we treat PH cells that we have isolated from PH patient with a drug who will target our protein of interest, and we perform assays of proliferation and resistance of death. If the results are good, we will test our drug in a PH animal model to see if we are able to decrease the pressure in right ventricle and in pulmonary artery. If yes, we will try to understand how our drug works on PH cells in order to explain the mechanism. It was a great pleasure to share that with you, and I wish you a great day and a great webinar. Bye-bye.
So Jan is one of our scholarship recipients from PHA Canada. And as you can see, his basic research didn't even focus specifically on pH. He was looking at cancer mechanisms, which are very similar in the basic understanding of PH disease as well. So that's the beginning. Once we move through the, once the new treatment has been identified to be safe and effective for the use in humans, we begin a process of clinical trials. What are clinical trials? There studies that are done to evaluate a treatment to determine, as I said, if it's safe and effective. And it often compares a new treatment to the standard treatments that have been used. And it also compares whether or not a treatment can be more effective, easier to use, decrease side effects, or it may be used in new populations such as children. Randomized clinical trials are considered to be the gold standard, and they're often done with groups of people that are comparing ever increasing in sizes and in length of time that a new treatment is going to be tested. What's interesting here is that people will not know whether or not they're in the test arm of the study or in the standardized treatment arm. So it's a comparison, and it's called a blind study because neither the patient nor the doctor nor the researcher will know which arm of the study that you've been assigned to. That's assigned usually by computerized randomization. So you may have heard the term placebo in discussions about clinical trials, and it's sometimes called a sugar pill, and it's a treatment, a pill or a liquid or a powder that actually has no treatment value. It's used in clinical trials to compare against the experimental treatment. But again, neither the patients nor the physicians will know which arm of the treatment or which side of the clinical trials they are participating in. But in trials for life-threatening or serious conditions, all patients will receive the experimental drug. So that's a concern that patients sometimes express about participating. Now, phase 1 of clinical trial, the very beginning, is safety and dosage are the primary focus. And these are usually smaller groups of patients that are tested for shorter periods of time. In phase 2 of a clinical trial, once something has been seen to be successful in the first phase and moves on to the second, the focus is on side effects and often on dosage. So what's the right dose without compromising both the impact on illness and any potential side effects. Phase 3 of clinical trials compares the new treatment again to existing treatments, and it's often for a much larger group of people, might be 1,000 to 2,000 persons, and it will continue on often for many months, sometimes for a year or more. In phase 4 of clinical trials, it's often referred to as real-world data. So this is what happens in studies of patients beyond that first 3 phases of the clinical trial. So what happens when someone is taking a drug? Potentially, it may be something that they take for the rest of their lives. So that real-world data is collected by individual patients who participate by providing information about their symptom management, about the long-term impact of the treatment. And the numbers of patients in each of the clinical trial phases, as you can see here, phase 1 are smaller groups for shorter time. Phase 2, increasingly larger groups of people for somewhat longer periods of time. And then phase 3 could be thousands of people for 1 to 3 years. And then that phase 4, which I mentioned, can go on across your lifetime. We're going to hear today from Steve Provencher, who's at the Laval Institute.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Provencher. I'm a respirologist from Quebec City. It's my pleasure to spend a few moments with you tonight talking about clinical trials. In fact, clinical trials are perhaps one of the most challenging, but also the most exciting parts of my work. Of course, from a patient's perspective, you may wonder whether you should participate in trials or not, because clinical trials are time-consuming. They require frequent study visits. Patients are exposed to medications for which we have limited experience in terms of side effects and tolerance. But on the other side, patients are very closely monitored. You see they're treating physicians and nurses very frequently. Patients also have access to novel therapies that may be quite effective. So they may have personal benefit in participating in clinical trials. But most of all, the main reason why myself and other physicians throughout Canada do spend time and energy in clinical trials is that this is the only way that we can get things better for PH patients. One of the best examples of that is looking at the therapies that are currently available in Canada. When I started treating patients 20 years ago, there was essentially nothing except for IV epoprostenol, which was effective but with significant side effects, and oral bosentan, which was investigated at that time. Now we have about 12 current 12 therapies currently available in Canada. And also we have witnessed significant improvement in long-term survival with PAH patients. We now follow patients that have been living with PAH for 10, 15, 20 years, something that we would have dreamed of 20 years ago. And the only reason this was possible is that over the last 20, 25 years, thousands of PAH patients throughout the world did participate in clinical trials to show that these therapies were effective, safe, and improved patients. Of course, things are not perfect right now. Long-term survival remains to be improved as well as your symptoms. So there's room for improvement. And again, the only way that we can get this improvement is through further research, further clinical trials. Of course, PAH is no different than other diseases because novel therapies need to be proven to be effective before they are approved and reimbursed. But PAH is associated with a significant challenge being a rare disease. And most of those trials need several hundreds, even thousands of PAH patients. So there's a clear need for patients to participate. So all taken together, I think there is much more pros and cons for you in participating in clinical trials. So I urge you to ask your medical team whether there are clinical trials ongoing in your center, see if you're eligible, and if so, I suggest that you strongly consider participating in those trials. So with that, I wish you a very nice evening. Bye-bye.
So I think we've heard a clear call to action on the benefits of clinical trials, and I hope you heard that very encouraging comments about 20 years ago, the limited availability of treatments for PH, and today, because of the participation of patients in clinical trials, that there's many more options, and that the success rates in terms of longevity are moving in the right direction. So what are the challenges that with clinical trials? And Steve, I think, has already outlined some of those. They benefit from having lots of participants, especially from underrepresented groups, women, children, racialized and minority groups. And public awareness about clinical trials remains low, even in rare diseases like PH, as we found in the recent community survey. Only 46% of patients who participated in that survey said that they were, although they were interested in participating, they didn't know how to access them. So we still have some work to do on making sure patients are aware of the opportunities. So what are the reasons that people might not want to enroll in a clinical trial? Again, Steve mentioned some of them, but as we learned again from the community survey, people talked about feeling worried about the risks of new therapies that haven't been fully tested. Some live too far away from research facilities. Some are worried their disease might get worse as a result of participating, or they're uncomfortable with the possibility of receiving a placebo. We mentioned that earlier. Or they're worried about doing extra invasive tests, including heart catheterization. So we would want to be able to share with you, though, the experience of one of our volunteers, Joanne, who's going to speak to us from Ottawa on this slide.
Hi, my name is Joanne Mainwood. I've had idiopathic arterial pulmonary hypertension for over 13 years. I live in Ottawa, and I'm followed by an excellent team at the Ottawa Heart Institute. A few years ago, my respirologist, George Chandy, offered me an opportunity to participate in the Sapphire Stem Cell Project. The study involved a process called apheresis that removed my blood, sent it to a lab, and while it was there, somehow magically, turned my blood cells into stem cells. The stem cells were then returned to my body. All participants in the study had at least 4 injections of stem cells, targeting some of the damage done by the pulmonary hypertension. After my injections, I felt better and I had more stamina. The study went on for a year and I was followed by a wonderful nurse named Julia, did many surveys and many medical tests just to monitor how things were going. The time and effort required to participate in such a study was so worth it. I felt better not only from the injections, but also because I was being proactive with my illness. As well, it allowed me to contribute to the PH community by providing research that might one day benefit all patients. Thank you. Hi.
So as you can hear from Joanne's very positive experience, she was very well supported in her experience in the clinical trial. One of the reasons was because of the support she received from her clinical team, including her nurse. And although she didn't specifically mention it, what we know is that one of the factors that really contributes to a positive experience is education. So people who are really well informed about what a clinical trial, what they can expect in clinical trials, what they can contribute, that they can change their mind at any time, for example. All of that important education is part of informed consent. And it is a critical right for you as a patient and as a critical component of the success of the clinical trials. So whether you're thinking buyer beware or being well informed is well armed, the consensus is that it's best to gather as much information as possible from really trusted sources, including doctors and family and friends, before you make that decision. So whatever your motivation, though, for participating, once you decide you're going to participate in a clinical trial, you become an important partner in scientific discovery. Your contribution helps not only you, but helps future generations and may, in fact, help to lead healthier lives. And major medical breakthroughs couldn't happen without the generosity of clinical trial participants, young and old. So now we've explained a bit about what the clinical trials process is and about the bench to bedside. Once a new treatment has been shown to have benefits, that's just part of the long journey to your bedside. Research provides the evidence for treatment safety and effectiveness, and then it has to be approved by government and other agencies before it makes it to our bedside. So the next step in this process, after the basic bench research and clinical trials, is the regulatory review. And this manufacturer of a new treatment will submit it to Health Canada, and Health Canada reviews it again for safety, effectiveness, and quality. And then if it's approved, it receives what's called a notice of compliance from Health Canada, and the drug can then be sold in Canada. And if it doesn't receive the notice of compliance, it can't be sold. While Health Canada is reviewing an application, there's another program that may be available. It's called the Special Access Program, and it's for seriously ill patients. And after clinical trials are done, and during the time Health Canada is reviewing, you can apply through your doctor, or typically your physician will do it for you, and request access to the drug before it's approved by Health Canada. This is only available on a compassionate or an emergency basis for life-threatening conditions and where other therapies have failed or they're unavailable. Now, the fourth step is to have ensure that patients have access to new treatments. So once it's approved by Health Canada, patients can have access to it either by paying out of pocket or possibly through private insurance coverage, but it isn't yet approved for provincial drug benefit coverage. So that's the next step, what's called public funding. And here it will go through a number of additional steps before a decision is made to fund it. And we're going to walk through that. So that's step 5, public funding approvals. Decisions about public funding are first submitted to health technology assessments, and a determination is made of the value of the treatment, not for individual patients, but to the overall benefit of society. So The decision is based on whether it will be listed, meaning listed for public funding, listed with clinical criteria for conditions, for example, a lower price, or it will not be listed at the submitted price, or it will not be listed at all. This sometimes happens with what's called me too drugs, where a new drug will come on the market that is identical to a lower price drug, and it may not be successful in being approved. Step 5 in the public funding approval process is to be submitted to what's called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and it's an alliance by the provinces and the territories. And its purpose is to achieve greater value for publicly funded drug programs and for patients through the use of what's termed combined negotiating power. And the mandate is to enhance patient access to clinically relevant and cost-effective drug treatment options. And it serves this mandate by conducting reviews, expert-informed reviews, and by negotiating with the manufacturers for the price. And so once that process is complete, the drug is still not available for public funding approval until each federal, provincial, and territorial government drug plan makes its own final decision. So you can just appreciate the complexity that's involved. And why is this important? Again, going back to our recent PH community survey, what we know is that more than 56% of respondents to the survey who are PH patients or their family are either fully or partially covered by publicly funded government insurance plans. So government funding for new treatments plays an important role in access to treatment. And now I'm going to turn it over, Jamie, to you to walk us through a particular case study that you're very familiar with.
Thanks, Pat. So we thought we would use an example of a drug most of you are familiar with that has gone through this process to give you sort of a sense of the various places in which, in particular, patients have a role to play in helping this process along. So Uptravi, otherwise known as selexipag, was first approved by Health Canada in January of 2016. At that point, PHA Canada had actually already launched the Take Action PAH campaign and was already advocating for access to new PAH therapies because Uptravi was just one of several that was new to Canada at the time. So it was approved by Health Canada in January. And then a couple of months later, it was before CADTH and the Common Drug Review, where that health technology assessment was taking place. And PHA Canada made a submission of what is called patient evidence. So we had surveyed the community and interviewed people who had been part of the clinical trials. And we put all that information together and put it in a submission to CADTH in April. Later that year, in October, CADTH recommended that Uptravi be funded by public drug plans with some criteria and some conditions, which is pretty typical when drugs are recommended for public funding. At the same time, ENES, which is the same sort of similar body that exists in Quebec specifically, they actually recommended against public funding. And so at that point in time, the Quebec government declined to fund Uptravi. So here we are, we're now like almost at the end of the year. It's been a year since the drug had been approved. We were advocating throughout this time that the provinces and the provincial and federal drug plans fund this drug as quickly as possible. And so finally, by March of 2017, more than a year since it had been approved, it had been invited into negotiations with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And so at that point, PHA Canada met with PCPA to again advocate for immediate access. And it wasn't until the end of that year, so nearly 2 years after its approval by Health Canada, that PCPA finally reached an agreement with the manufacturer on what the price would be for those public drug plans. And then somewhat sort of interestingly, by March of 2018, about a year and a half after Quebec had decided against funding the drug, Quebec actually became the first jurisdiction to list Uptravi on their public formulary. Later that year, by June, we saw Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Newfoundland list. And then by the end of 2018, again, almost 3 years, 2 years since it had been funded, or approved rather, almost 3 years since it had been approved, we saw it finally funded across the entire province. So we're going to invite one of our advocates who was a big part of this campaign at the time and has been an advocate for all PH patients for many years, Joan Pollitt. She's a director on our board of directors and a former ambassador. I'll let Joan introduce herself, and then Joan's just going to speak a little bit again about this important role that patients play throughout this regulatory process. Welcome, Joan.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Jamie. Yes, Jamie and Pat have asked me to answer basically a question. What is the role of patients in all parts of drug development, approval, and funding? What are the patients' roles in those processes? Let me start by saying that I am relatively new to this drug development, approval, and funding process that Pat and Jamie have just outlined for you. My daughter was diagnosed with severe pulmonary arterial hypertension in 2014. But what I've learned through my advocacy is that patient stories and voices have always been important at the drug approval and funding stages of the process. Patient stories add the human dimension to a decision that is generally an economically based calculation. Turns out, conversations about pain and suffering and lack of treatment options do impact decision makers. And the approval of Uptravi was a case in point. The drug had been approved by Health Canada, but access was not guaranteed across Canada. So as Jamie has mentioned, PHA Canada started an advocacy campaign in partnership with Scleroderma Canada to have patients across the country send signed petitions to their local provincial and federal politicians about the importance of this oral therapy to the PH community. In addition, patient and caregiver advocates met with decision makers and spoke about their experiences with site infections, blocked catheters, time spent mixing medications, and hospital stays. They spoke of an improved quality of life that they expected on an oral therapy. Patients not yet on IV therapy spoke of the negative impacts that a transition to an IV therapy would have on their quality of life. It was a slow process, but Uptravi is now available across Canada. Patient advocacy works. And this type of advocacy has traditionally been the area where patient engagement in the drug approval process has had the most impact. But what is becoming more obvious to me on my advocacy journey is the increasingly important role of patient engagement and patient-based data in the research and drug development stages. Patients, caregivers, advocates can literally now get involved in almost every stage of the processes outlined in this webinar. Why the change? Because researchers, manufacturers, and regulatory agencies realize that rare disease patients understand more about their disease than most other patients. You are the expert in your disease because there are so few of you with the disease. You live every day with disease symptoms, side effects, and a roller coaster of emotions, doctor's appointments, and setbacks. Your doctor knows a lot about the disease from a clinical perspective, but you have what is called lived experience. And with rare diseases, lived experiences, and what is referred to as real-world evidence will increasingly be used to support not only approval decisions, but the direction of research and the setup of clinical trials. Case in point was a PH priority setting consultation initiated in 2022 by Dr. Jason Weatherald, one of our PH physicians in our Edmonton clinic. It was held virtually over 2 days and included patients, caregivers, nurses, and doctors, with the goal of determining where future Canadian PH research should be directed. The initial survey that established a large list of possible research initiatives was made available online, and patient input was a key component. Results of the consultation will be available at a future date. This was a first for our community, but patient perspectives on their disease, side effects, and treatments are being asked by researchers across the rare disease spectrum. And a lot of this information is now being aggregated in national patient registries that have the added benefit of providing researchers with larger volumes of data that can be used to uncover previously unknown disease pathways. And patients, as mentioned previously, have always played a significant role in the clinical trial process. Without patients, there is no trial. But even the patient role within clinical trials is changing because, unfortunately, the way clinical trials are set up, most PH patients cannot meet the eligibility criteria to be included in a trial. They are either too sick, not sick enough, or they have other disease states that could impair the trial results. And Pat had mentioned that at a phase 3 clinical trial, there can be upwards of several thousands of people in that trial. In reality, in rare disease trials, we might be talking several hundred people. And so with so few patients who have the disease and even fewer who are eligible to qualify for the trial, clinical data that can prove the new treatment is effective becomes very hard to come by. Clinical trial designs are changing so that more patients may become eligible to participate, and different measurements, including patient-reported outcomes and information available in patient registries, will be used to determine whether a drug should be approved. Think of all of the ways throughout the drug cycle that your voice, your lived experience, and your data can make the difference. Your involvement can be as passive as ensuring your data is available in a patient registry or in a biobank, by completing surveys like our Canadian PH Community Survey or Dr. Weatherald's Priority Setting Partnership Survey, or by signing and sending petitions to your federal and provincial territorial politicians to support approval and equal access to all approved medications, no matter where you live in Canada. And for patients and caregivers who have the time and energy, do consider visiting your local politicians to improve awareness of PH and advocate for earlier access to new medications, or consider becoming a PHA Canada ambassador and help bring improved awareness of the disease to patients, your community, and decision makers. Thank you.
Thanks
Joan,
so much, Joan.
Fabulous. So we hope today's webinar has helped to pull back the curtain, demystify what that process looks like. It is complex, but there is a role for patients every step of the way. And as Joan has so clearly articulated, and Jamie, the important contributions of advancing research can't happen without you. And especially in that the fabulous case study that Jamie and Joan have talked about with Uptravi, you can see the difference that sharing your story makes. So our team is here every step of the way for those of you who want to participate, whether participating, as Joan outlined, in clinical trials or in processes to advocate on behalf of patients for access, or helping to set priorities. Our job is to support you in all of the things that are important to you about changing the future for people with PH in Canada. So Jamie, I'll give you the last word, and I will put up a slide so you know how to contact us.
Sure. I just want to acknowledge the people who came to this webinar when it was live and the excellent questions that they asked. We did have a really great discussion that unfortunately won't get captured here. Thank you for watching this webinar on YouTube, on our website, and I look forward to seeing you at whatever our next live event might be, whether it's here on Zoom or in person, so that we can continue this important discussion together. So thank you to Joan for your time twice, and to Pat. We look forward to the exciting things that are coming in new research, in new patient engagement, and in advocating on behalf of the needs of all Canadians with PH. So thank you, everybody, and good afternoon, wherever you are.